All right, hello everybody. So this is part one, and today we're going to look at the Russo-Japanese War, or the events leading up to the Russo-Japanese War, the Protectorate Treaty of 1905, and then eventual annexation by the Japanese in 1910. So as we have discussed in the last lecture, we looked at how after the opening of Korea, this caused quite a bit of turmoil, and there were many countries that were interested in what was happening in Korea at the time, namely Japan, China, Russia, the British, and then to a lesser extent, the French, the Germans, and the Americans. So in 1895, when this was after the conclusion of the Sino-Japanese War, and during the Kabul Reform movement. So the Kabul Reforms were a widespread program of reforms that were supported by the Japanese. The Japanese had placed their advisors in various areas of the government, and this was an effort to reform Korea politically, economically, socially, and one of the outcomes of this was, though, because of the political reform, this meant that the powers of the throne, the king, were reduced. And so really, this was a move towards a more modernized system of government. But King Kojong and his Queen Min were very opposed to this and to the reduction of their power. So because the Japanese, and since Queen Min started to turn to the Russians and had started to play off the powers, the Japanese felt that Queen Min was a major obstacle to not only the reform movement, but also to the Japanese efforts to try to increase their influence in Korea. So as a result, they masterminded the assassination of Queen Min in 1895, in October of 1895. And because the assassination occurred on the grounds of Gyeongbok Palace, this happened right in front of Kojong's eyes. And after this occurred, he realized that he was vulnerable to these kinds of attacks and became fearful for his own life. So in February of 1896, Kojong fled to the Russian legation, and the Russian legation at the time was situated right behind Toksu Palace. He escapes there. Why does he go to the Russian legation? Well, in the previous year, the Russians had allied with the French and the Germans to stage the triple intervention after the conclusion of the Sino-Japanese War, and so they pretty much had been able to strong-arm Japan into renegotiating the terms of the Sino-Japanese War. So as Kojong flees to the Russian legation and he seeks refuge there and is ruling the country from there, this then shifts the balance of power into Russia's favor. And there were those in the government who had been pro-Japanese cabinet members such as Kim Hong-jip and Oh Eun-jung. These individuals were murdered. They were eliminated. Others fled to Japan. And so we see then a cabinet forming in Korea of pro-Russian and pro-American officials. The Japanese advisors were dismissed and they were replaced by Russian advisors. So we see now that the favor has shifted to Russia. But during this time that Kojong is at the Russian legation, there's a change in perspective, and this is primarily because there were two secret treaties that were established between Russia and the Japanese. The first was this Weber-Kumura Pact of May of 1896. And in this pact, this allowed the two countries, they agreed that they could both interfere in Korean internal affairs. And it also granted Russia the right to station 4 companies of military troops in Korea. And required that Japan recognize this new pro-Russian faction in the Korean government, led by Lee Won-young. So there was this first pact that was signed between Russia and Japan in May of 1896, and then a second one signed in June of 1896. This was the Lobanov-Yamagata Treaty. And in this treaty, the two countries agreed that they would guarantee Korean independence through a tacit co-protectorate maintained by both Japan and Russia. The aim of this was to preserve Korea as a buffer state between Japan and Russian interests in Manchuria and the Russian maritime provinces. And the agreement also stated that they would jointly try to encourage fiscal reform in Korea and to promote the formation of a modern police, a modern army, and to maintain telegraph lines. So once these secret agreements between Japan and Russia became public, this began to change the perception of Russia as not really trustworthy. So Ko-jung has this growing mistrust of Russia. He makes an appeal or a formal request to England and the United States for their good offices. If you recall, the Joseon Dynasty had signed treaties with England and the US in the 1880s, and one of the formalities in these treaties is that these countries would offer their good offices. So he formally requests their good offices, and he concludes secret agreements with France and Germany, and then started to distribute railway and mining concessions. So his idea was that if these foreign countries had a vested financial interest in Korea, then they would be forced to take a foreign interest or diplomatic interest as well in Korean affairs. He fires his Russian advisors and hires in 1899 the Secretary of the U.S. Minister W.F. Sands as a domestic advisor. So we have now the favor shifting to the United States. But what occurs after Ko-jung leaves the Russian legation about a year after he stayed for approximately a year there, and he declares the establishment of the Daehan Empire in October of 1897. Ko-jung is really quite aware of the need for political autonomy of Korea. And so there we see this effort to raise the symbolic power of the state through certain emblems. There's a national flag, there's a national anthem, an updated wardrobe, as you can see here, and he's traded out his traditional Korean costume for this faux Prussian Kaiser-like uniform. And then as this is all occurring, we see in the area in China, there's also the Boxer Uprising. So this occurs between 1899 and 1901. We've already discussed this, how it was a anti-colonial, anti-Christian movement that took place in China. And since they began to attack foreigners there, the an 8-nation alliance was formed, and approximately 20,000 troops, foreign troops, entered into Korea or entered into China, and then suppressed this movement. So when this happened, under these pretenses, you have these Qing imperial soldiers that are also participating in the Boxer uprising. Here's a depiction of this, and you can see there are foreign soldiers from representing different countries who are participating in suppressing the Boxer uprising. But what occurred was they attacked the foreign legation quarter in Peking. This is a map of the old foreign legation quarter. We can see, the Austrians are here, the Italians were here, the Russian training company here, the Germans, the French, the Japanese, the Spanish, the U.S. legation, the Russians, the British. So they were all housed in this quarter here, and they were attacked. So because of these attacks, the foreign troops were sent in. Here's another depiction. I believe this was by the Japanese. So here is the fall of the Peking castle. And again, these various foreign troops that are storming the Forbidden City. And what happened was, under these pretenses, was the Russians said, well, our people are being attacked, and so we need to move troops into China in order to protect them. So the Tsar's government then moved approximately 200,000 troops into Manchuria. Now, the Boxers had, at this point, destroyed railways, cut telegraph lines, and they had burned mines. So the Russians, they sent in this large military presence and basically occupied all of Manchuria. Part of this, too, was for the protection and the development of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So by this point, Russia has consolidated its empire and connected the western and eastern parts of its empire. And to connect these two parts, they started building the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And it was constructed from 1891 to 1913. The main line ran from St. Petersburg and went all the way through Siberia into Vladivostok. So we see Vladivostok in this area right here. And this is right on the border of Manchuria and the northern part of Korea. And to unite this vast empire, they had to build the biggest railroad in the world. It cost about 1.5 billion rubles, which in modern terms is about $60 to $70 million. It ran the length of 9,000 kilometers, and it went through various temperatures. Often during the cold months, temperatures in Siberia ranged from -10 to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. So, this was a monster, a behemoth of a railway that the Russians built. But it was also extremely important for the Russians because this connected strategic points in the Russian Empire to Port Arthur, which we see, which is in an area in China that allowed for year-round trade because it was really the only warm water port that the Russians had. And it allowed the Russians to move troops and supplies across 9,000 kilometers of very difficult terrain in only 7 days. And it opened the path for Russian trade, giving them a market in which they could sell products like grain and become real power players on the international scale. So it did all of these things and also became a symbol of Russian strength. So the Trans-Siberian Railway was extremely important to the Russians and their empire. Here we see Port Arthur is right here. Okay, so it's in the southern portion of Manchuria, and it also became an effective economic capital in that area. Russia really depended on this city as a main hub to provide products to and from Russia. So, connecting Port Arthur here with Vladivostok, going through Manchuria and to Vladivostok, and then connecting to the Trans-Siberian Railway, which connected it to the opposite end of its empire. So because of rising Russian influence and its expansion eastward, its consolidation of its empire, this started to be perceived as a threat to not only England, but also to Japan. So England, which was the largest empire in the world, but on the decline, Russia consolidating its empire on the rise, it was perceived as a threat by Britain, and it was also perceived as a threat by Japan, because as they further started to encroach southward and make more of a presence in the East Asian area, they had also had conflicts with Japan over the Sakhalin Islands here. So both of these countries, Britain and Japan, they became concerned about the Russians. And so in January of 1902, Britain and Japan, they entered into a formal alliance. And in this alliance, Japan recognized Britain and their influence in China. So they said, okay, we will allow you, Britain, to do what you want to in China, but Britain must allow Japan to do what they want to do in Korea. So they pledged to assist each other if either became involved in a war against a third power. The United States, they had annexed Hawaii in 1898. They had taken the Philippines from Spain in 1899. Previously, they had really only been concerned with the rights of trade, but 2 days after the signing of this Anglo-Japanese treaty, the U.S. Secretary of State Rutherford Hayes, he demanded equal treatment for all countries in trade and navigation in China, and then he implicitly aligns himself or aligns the United States with Britain and Japan. So, at this point in 1902, Japan has the support of the British and the Americans. Now, we have increasing tension between the Russians and the Japanese. As I had said, the Russians had moved approximately 200,000 troops into Manchuria and were controlling the area. And the Japanese had protested this. They said, you got to move these troops out. And so Russia promises that they will, but they don't. And so in July of 1903, Russian forces cross into North Korean the area in northern Korea, and they occupy the Korean river town of Yonganpo, which is approximately, if I can find my cursor, approximately right about there. So they occupy that area, and Russia formally requests the lease of a port there. The Japanese are opposed to this, so the Russians back down, but the Russians had already opened up Yonganpo as a trading port. So now they have really, they're really coming further southwards in an aggressive manner. So the Japanese decide to go to war with Russia. In February of 1904, Japan carries out a surprise attack on Russia at Port Arthur. Very strategic. Korea immediately proclaims neutrality, and Japan sends in troops into Seoul and forces Korea to sign an agreement or a series of agreements which forces Korea to accept Japanese counsel regarding improvements in the government administration, and it also allows Japan to occupy strategic points in the country. In August of 1904, they were also forced to sign another agreement where Japanese or Japanese named advisors were installed in strategic Korean ministries of finance and foreign affairs. So on February 6, 1904, Japan severs relations with the Russians. On February 8th, Japan they launched a surprise attack at Port Arthur, and on February 10th, Japan formally declares war against Russia. And what we have then is a series of battles between the Japanese and the Russians, and quite a bit of success experienced by the Japanese. All right, we will conclude our look at this first part of the Russo-Japanese War, the annexation, or the Protectorate Treaty and the annexation. So this concludes part one, and we will continue on with a closer look at the Russo-Japanese War. All right, so this is part two. We are looking at the events leading up to the Russo-Japanese War, the war itself, and then what transpired after that. So, as I mentioned in part one, the Japanese had launched a surprise attack on the Russians, and so they formally declared war against the Russians on February 10th of 1904. Now, if we look at a moment and compare the two countries, so there were really great differences in size and population of Russia and Japan. The Japanese population at the time was approximately 46 million people, whereas the population of Russia was about 130 million, so nearly 3 times the size of Japan. Russia held about 1/6 of the world's landmass under its control, and so the Russians were really quite complacent with themselves. One Russian author described the Japanese as little people who lived in paper houses and wasted hours on flower arrangement and tea ceremonies. So, you know, they were really quite condescending and arrogant, but there were quite a bit of Russian disadvantages. Not only were most Japanese sailors literate and Russian sailors were not, but also despite the Trans-Siberian Railroad, Russia was still at quite a disadvantage for bringing in reinforcements and naval forces. So the Russian supply lines were much longer than Japan. Japan was right next to Korea. And for Russia, its goal was to really hold Port Arthur during the duration of the time that it took the Russian Baltic Fleet to travel the long distance around Europe and the Horn of Africa to get to Manchuria. But unfortunately for the Russians, by the time their Baltic Fleet arrived in the area, the Japanese were waiting for them, and we have these very decisive battles that took place between the two. So here, the Russo-Japanese War, much like the Sino-Japanese War, is very well documented and plays a big role in the artwork that was established at the time. Here is a painting by the Japanese. You have these Russian soldiers here who are being slaughtered by the Japanese army. The Battle of Port Arthur, this was extremely decisive for the Japanese because this allowed the Japanese to cut off supply lines for the Russians. Here you see these Japanese ships who are sinking the Russian ships. Again, another depiction of the capture of Port Arthur. And here another Japanese ship that has just sunk the Russian ship. A Japanese soldier slaughtering a Russian or yes, I mean, there's just so much artwork that was produced at this time. And it was really quite a point of pride for the Japanese because, as I had mentioned, Japan was much smaller in size, in population. The Russians were pretty complacent that they were and confident that they were going to be able to defeat the Japanese. And the fact that the Japanese were experiencing a succession of victories, this was really quite a point of pride for the Japanese. Here you see the Japanese soldiers marching through Korea. And this is a depiction of a Russian train that is being smashed. The Battle of Ulsan, this was also a decisive victory. If we look at the Battle of Tsushima, Russians lost about 5,000, so about 5,000 were killed, whereas for the Japanese, only about 110 were killed in this particular battle. All right, so with these decisive battles, in 1905, a peace treaty was negotiated through President Roosevelt of the United States. This occurred in July of 1905, and in this peace treaty, the U.S. As the Russo-Japanese War is occurring, the United States decides to decisively align itself with Japan through the Taft-Katsura Agreement in July of 1905. So in this agreement, the U.S. recognizes Japanese domination in Korea, and the Japanese recognize U.S. hegemony in the Philippines in return. In August of 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt negotiated the peace treaty between the Russians and the Japanese, and in September of 1905, the peace treaty was finally signed. This was the Treaty of Portsmouth, and in this treaty, Japan was granted the South Sakhalin portion, the South Sakhalin Island, and the Liaotung Peninsula. The Liaotung Peninsula was something that Japan really wanted to occupy from early on. They had won this in their defeat of the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War back in 1895, but it had been taken away from them because of the Triple Intervention. Now they got it back. So in 1905, they get the Liaotung Peninsula. In this treaty, Russia pledges not to hinder Japan from taking action in Korea, and this then gives Japan a free hand in Korea. No one is left to challenge Japan, right? The Chinese have been defeated in the Sino-Japanese War. The Russians have now been defeated in the Russo-Japanese War. The British have signed a formal alliance with Korea, and the U.S. has now signed a treaty with Japan. So there's nobody left to contest the Japanese in Korea, and Japanese influence now is firmly established. Here we see a depiction of this. We see Japan and the Russians trying to impinge upon them, but they are being blocked by the Japanese. So On November 9th, 1905, after the Treaty of Portsmouth between Russia and Japan, after that is signed, Ito Hirobumi arrives in Seoul. Japanese troops then surround the palace. Hirobumi, he threatens Kojong and his ministers. He demands that they sign a treaty that would make Korea into a protectorate. Korean officials protest, so Japanese soldiers go to the foreign ministry to bring the official seal. Kojong, he also protests, but then he leaves. He just, I guess, can't deal with it. And so the Korean cabinet is forced to approve this treaty, and the seal is affixed to the treaty on November 17th, 1905. And this is the forced signing of the Protectorate Treaty. There were 5 traders associated with this treaty. These were officials serving under Kojong who signed the treaty against Kojong's wishes. And the signing of this treaty, it stripped Korea of its powers to deal with other countries. It could not engage in international affairs with other countries. The 5 officials were the Education Minister Lee Wan-yong, the Army Minister Lee Geun-taek, the Interior Minister Lee Ji-yong, the Foreign Affairs Minister Park Jae-sun, the Agriculture, Commerce, and Industry Minister Kwon Jung-hyun. Okay, so these were the 5 traders. It gave full authority to Japan of Korea's foreign relations, and then a residency general was established in Korea. Ito Hirobumi becomes the first resident general. He is supposed to occupy a position directly under the Korean emperor, under Kojong, and then under the direction of the resident general, there were Japanese resident councils who were placed at the different treaty ports in Korea. There were many Korean officials who protested this, including Min Young-hwan. But if we look at the Protectorate Treaty, the Article 1 of the treaty says, the government of Japan, through the Department of Foreign Affairs at Tokyo, will hereafter have control and direction of the external relations and affairs of Korea, and the diplomatic and consular representatives of Japan will have the charge of the subjects and interests of Korea in foreign countries. So, as you can see here, Korea no longer has the ability to deal with foreign countries. That is to be taken care of by Japan. Article 2. The government of Japan undertakes to see to the execution of the treaties actually existing between Korea and other powers, and the government of Korea is not to conclude hereafter any act of engagement having an international character except through the medium of the government of Japan. So, this prohibited Korea from making treaties with foreign powers, and essentially Korea had surrendered its right to being an independent foreign policy. According to Article 3, Japan would appoint a high-level official called the Resident General to supervise all political activity in Korea, and without his permission, no political decisions of nationwide importance could be made. We see in the New York Times on December 14th, there is an article where Japan denies that they have coerced Korea into signing this Protectorate Treaty, and the Japanese released their official account of the treaty negotiations that were released. So it appears as if that Korea willingly, voluntarily signed this treaty. There are many reactions to this treaty. Chang Jian, who was the editor of the Hwangseong Shinmun, or the Hwangseong newspaper, He wrote an article entitled "Today We Cry in Lamentation." Frederick Mackenzie, he wrote the book The Tragedy of Korea, and Homer Hobart wrote the book The Passing of Korea, dedicating it to the Emperor Gojong and the Korean people. Hobart wrote that this was a token of high esteem and a pledge of unwavering allegiance at a time when calumny has done its worst and justice has suffered an eclipse. So, and he describes the forced signing of the 1905 treaty and Japanese insistence that this was voluntary. And so Hobart was basically trying to expose the Japanese and let others know that this was not a voluntarily signed treaty. Min Young-hwan, upon hearing of this treaty, he supposedly fainted several times, and Min and other officials, they pleaded with Gojong to try to annul the treaty and to execute the 5 traitors who had signed it, but was pretty much silenced by the Japanese. And so because of this, Min decided to commit suicide on November 30th, 1905. After his death, in his pockets were found 5 identical messages that were left to the great powers of China, Great Britain, the United States, France, and Germany, in which he pleaded with those powers to recognize the true situation of Korea. He also left a message to the people of Korea in which he tried to promise to help his fellow countrymen. So these are Min's final words, where he says, "Alas, the nation's shame and the people's disgrace have come to this point where our people are in the midst of a life and death struggle. Young-hwan alone, by dying, repays the emperor's grace and offers an apology to his 20 million fellow countrymen, his brothers, so that even if Young-hwan dies, he is not dead, but without fail will help you gentlemen from the netherworld. If you, my fellow brothers, make 1 million times more your effort, strengthening this will and spirit, exercising your learning, making an all-out effort with a resolute mind, and restore our freedom and independence, then the dead will rejoice from afar and laugh. Oh, do not lose 1 iota of your desire. These are my parting words to my 20 million fellow countrymen of the Daehan Empire." So, this was really quite a shock to the Korean people and to those in the Korean government. Unfortunately, there was not much that could be done, and over the next year and a half, 2 years, the Japanese would increase their control in Korea. There's a gradual tightening. By August 1st, 1907, there was a new agreement that was signed, giving the Resident General formal authority to intercede in all matters of internal administration. So whereas the original Protectorate Treaty gave Japan authority over diplomatic affairs, in August of 1907, now the Resident General has power over all internal administration. This was essentially a government by vice ministers, with Japanese bureaucrats installed in every ministry as second in command. Also in 1907, Japan dissolves the Korean army. There were approximately 3,600 Korean troops in Seoul and 4,800 in local regiments. So, this wasn't a large army, but this meant now, with its disbandment, that Korea no longer had any capacity for self-defense. And then we also see the rise of righteous armies, these Uibyang, who are trying to also fight against the Japanese. Gojong decides to send 3 representatives to The Hague. And so on June 25th, 1907, these 3 men arrived. They checked in at a hotel. They hoisted the national flag of Korea from the window. And their goal was to try to expose the injustice of the 1905 Protectorate Treaty and to show that this was a naked act of aggression on Japan's part and that Korea had not agreed to signing this. So they started beseeching the world powers. They met with the ministers of Russia and the Netherlands and asked them for help in being admitted to the conference as official delegates of Korea. However, they were flatly denied, and they were not allowed to attend. They were not allowed to speak at the conference, and this was all on the grounds that, based on the 1905 treaty, Korea was no longer a sovereign power. So many governments by this point had already recognized the Protectorate Treaty and as a result refused to deal with or interact with these Korean delegates. So the three Korean emissaries, they then turned to the delegates of the United States, France, China, and Germany. But all of those powers turned their backs on Korea. So because Kojong had dispatched these representatives to the Hague Conference, the Japanese felt that he was becoming not easily controlled. And so Ito Hirobumi, he then forces Kojong to abdicate from the throne, and in his stead, Sujong takes the throne in 1907. What also occurs in 1907 is Japan proclaims laws that take away the people's freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. So all of these things combined, we have a further tightening of Japanese control. There are also many of these righteous armies, as I just mentioned. Some Confucian literati organized these, but these were active struggles against Japan. After the disbandment of the army in 1907, we see these former soldiers and military. They then join these righteous armies and they become active in engaging against the Japanese. And so we see the growth of these righteous armies. They become a little bit better organized and they have a little bit better weapons. They number about 60 throughout the country, all the way from the southern part to the northern part of Korea. So they basically became nationwide. And in 1907, they organized an attack on the Residency General. So approximately 10,000 troops gather. They got within about 8 miles of Dongdaemun before they were driven back. But because between 1907 and 1908, they increase their activities and their attacks. The Japanese begin to organize in response. And so from 1908, we see a decline in the activity of the righteous armies. And after colonization, many of them have to move up into Manchuria and then operate from Manchuria. Why do we see this decline? Well, the Japanese, for one, had superior weapons, superior firepower. The Japanese had state-of-the-art cannons, machine guns, repeaters, mounted cavalry, and the Koreans were using antique muzzle loaders, because they didn't really have these modern weapons and would be captured and their weapons confiscated. It was difficult for them to operate. All right, so then this leads up to the eventual annexation of Korea by Japan. This occurred on August 22nd, 1910. where Japan presents Sunjong with the annexation treaty. He refuses to sign it. So the treaty is the national seal is of the Korean Empire is affixed to the treaty and signed by Prime Minister Lee Wan-yong and then the resident general Count Teruichi Masatake of the Empire of Japan. So this marks the formal annexation of Korea by Japan and the beginning of the colonial period.